resume recording. And okay. So welcome to all the people who are joining us at the moment. I'm admitting you now, and it'll take a couple of minutes because there is a lot of people joining us today. So bear with us as we let a bunch of you all in. Here you come. So imagine, if you will, while I'm admitting everybody in, that it is actually quite a okay Brisbane evening after a period of ridiculous sweat, followed by a period of ridiculous rain. We have had all the weather up here, and I'm sure that I've heard complaints from down south as well. The weather has been not very kind, but it's actually not a bad evening tonight. So imagine that you were at Avid Reader in a balmy, slightly sweaty, but not too bad evening as the sun is going down. And we're all, you know, in this weird world that we're in on Zoom, where we're all kind of crowded together, hugging and kissing, mask free. There is no COVID. This is the imaginary world of our Zoom events. We thought that we would be in person tonight, which would have been incredibly exciting. We have managed a couple of in-person events this year at Avid Reader, which has been mind-blowing, but we will touch wood and hope that in future we will be able to get everybody together in the one room yet again without threatening to infect anybody. So we still have some more people entering. So I'm just going to shoot the breeze with everyone for a minute or two as we let people in. Of course, we are very excited to be hosting the Griffith Review yet again. The events that we have with the Griffith Review are always some of our best attended and some of our most thought-provoking events, and also on our YouTube channel where we upload our events at a later date. They are often some of our most watched events. So if you enjoy this one, you might want to go to our YouTube channel and find some of the other ones, because we have really had some doozies over the last couple of years. And luckily, there's evidence of that because of the Zoom world that we're in now. Okay, I'm just letting a few more people in. And I may just multitask, admit people, and start our event rolling. So welcome everybody to Avid Reader Bookshop. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any other elders who are here with us tonight. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. And because we are meeting again on Zoom, we are zooming out onto the lands of many different Aboriginal people right across this country. And so anyone who is zooming in from anywhere in Australia will be on Aboriginal land. And I'd like to acknowledge the elders of the land that you are joining us from, and to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging on your lands as well. Feel free to let us know where you're joining us from in the chat function. That chat function is actually where you'll be able to communicate with us. So what I'm going to do is show you where that all is by sending you a link to purchase the book. So that's a nice little marketing thing I did there, putting the link to the book in so you can go in and purchase a copy, but you can also tell us where you're calling in from. We have someone from Gubby Gubby Land already telling us where they're from. Boregaland, I don't know where that is, I'm sorry. But there are so many different countries in this one country, and it's very exciting to see where you're all calling in from. All right, so just a couple more admissions and then we'll get underway. I am going to, today it's my great pleasure to hand the reins over to the wonderful Ashley Hay, who is going to be taking over. And at the end of the event tonight, I will be able to ask your questions for you, or not everyone's, because we may have hundreds of people here in the room, but just some of the questions at the end, I'll be able to ask the panel. So if you do have questions at any time, feel free to type them into that chat function. And at the end of the event, I will ask them for you. You will only be able to speak to the host and co-host tonight, but I will pass on your questions and your comments to Ashley and the folks at the Griffith Review as well afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to the wonderful Ashley Hay, who is the editor of the Griffith Review, a former literary editor of the Bulletin, and a prize-winning author who's published 3 novels and 4 books of non-fiction, all of which are fantastic. And I completely recommend that you go and check out Ashley's other books, including her recent republication of Gum, which sounds like something that I not necessarily purchased because it's a book about trees, but this is more than that. This is an amazing book. So I do recommend that everybody race out and check out your book on Gum. And I will hand over to Ashley Hay. Ashley.
Thank you, Chrissy, and hello everyone. Thank you so much to all of you and to Kath Keenan's dog for joining us this evening. Yes, we are back in the Zoom world, which the upside of that is you can join us from wherever you are. We're thrilled tonight to be celebrating the launch of Griffith Review 75, Learning Curves, which is an edition that navigates education in all sorts of forms and what we can learn about learning. It feels like a pretty good way to launch into the school year. Launching into the school year is something that those of us in Queensland have only just managed to do in this moment. But thanks to everyone for yet another pivot. Here we are online. We were hoping to be with you all in Avid. Grateful to know that you're all out there. Very grateful to our 2 panelists for joining us on the other side of a border, but at least that border is open now. So I feel like we're getting incrementally closer to being back in the same place. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands where I am tonight. That's the lands that hold both Avid Reader, the offices of Griffith Review and my house, the lands of the Yagara and the Turrbal people. And I'd also like to acknowledge the lands where Kath and Bree are and where all of you are this evening. I'd like to acknowledge elders, past, present and emerging, and the extraordinary privilege of living and working on land that has been cared for so long. I'd like to acknowledge too the millennia of stories that have been told on this continent, and to acknowledge the particular privilege that we can still gather together and tell these stories even across the 2 years, like the 2 years that we've had this pandemic thing. I want to say at the outset that this edition of Griffith Review, Learning Curves, is relatively COVID-free, which feels like it might be a bit of a selling point at the moment. There are little bits and pieces. I'm not sure that there will ever not be little bits and pieces ever again. Even though COVID took us in a school sense from a normal world of classrooms and playgrounds to the suddenly highly normalised space of everyone homeschooling, where pre-COVID that had only been about 0.5% of Australia's school population, that isn't what this book explores. The book's called Learning Curves, and those curves, those kind of explorations are its focus. The learning that can take place in institutions, the learning that can take place beyond institutions, and the learning that can take place, importantly, I think, about them. The image on the cover is a new work by the wonderful Australian artist and writer Sean Tan, completing back-to-back appearances for Sean with us. We were thrilled to publish his amazing short story Pigeon in our last edition last November. And I love the sort of curiosity in the sense of setting off, the kind of whimsy of this figure going off onto that road with his little bunny ears. He looks like the perfect kind of adventurer. That feels to me like the start of so many stories and so many inquiries. And I also particularly love the way that that very kind of, it speaks to that very sort of personal prism that a lot of the writers in this particular edition of Griffith Review have brought to bear on the work that they've made for us here. Essays, fiction, memoir, poetry, and as we're going to talk about particularly tonight, the reportage, which again, in this COVID era, reportage is an interesting undertaking in and of itself. I know that there are many, many contributors in the audience to this edition, in the audience tonight. I'm not going to try to acknowledge you all because I'll miss people and that will make me feel terrible. I also know that we've got a lot of past contributors in the audience tonight, and also a lot of people who we know we're going to be working with in the future. So thank you all for being there. I'd particularly like to acknowledge Paula McLean, who is out there somewhere in the virtual universe, dialing in. We're thrilled to be working with McLean Foundation as our publishing partner for this edition. This is our third collaboration with them through Griffith Review. We're incredibly grateful to the foundation for the support and the encouragement that they give us to imagine and curate the conversations that happen inside the book and the conversations that happen beyond its pages as well. I would like quickly to acknowledge some key people from our Griffith University world, our publisher and Pro-Vice Chancellor of Arts, Education and Law, Professor Scott Harrison, Maureen Sullivan, who's Griffith University's librarian and a member of our advisory board, and also Professor Jerry Doherty, who's the Dean of Research in Arts, Education and Law. Again, apologies if I am missing anyone. We had more than 350 registrations for this event, which is exciting, but makes me fearful that I'll have missed some names in the list. So thank you again to everyone for being here. It means the world to us to know that you're there. I'm going to introduce you to the two contributors to Learning Curves that I'll be talking with tonight. To Catherine Keenan, first of all, who is a former journalist with the Sydney Morning Herald and the co-founder and executive director of Story Factory. In 2016, Kath was recognised for her work in community, connection and literacy when she was selected as Australian of the Year Local Hero. And Kath's story for Learning Curves takes us to the very beginning of the experience of reading. Now, perhaps lots of us don't necessarily think about where it all begins or why. For those people, of course, who are not adept at this skill, it makes everything, not just the act of reading, incredibly hard. And in this very powerful and expansive work of reportage, Kath explains just what is unlocked in our brains by early literacy and some of the ways that we might inspire a reading revolution. Kath, thank you very much for being here, or rather there, with us tonight.
Thank you.
I'd also like to welcome Bree Lee, who is an award-winning writer, academic and activist, the author of Beauty, of Eggshell Skull, and most recently, Who Gets to Be Smart. Bree's journalism, criticism and short fiction have been published in many major Australian outlets, including the monthly The Guardian and previously with Griffith Review. And her latest initiative is Freedom Inside, which is a collaboration with the Women's Justice Network, which allows the public to purchase and donate books to women who are incarcerated in New South Wales. Bree's piece of reportage for Learning Curves, which is an incredibly rich and challenging and useful piece, as Kath and I have just been talking about, explores some of the complexities of Australia's early childhood systems, unpacking a little bit the false distinction that's often placed around ideas of care and ideas of education for young kids, and looking at what that false distinction reinforces, particularly in our ideas of motherhood. So these two stories take us in a way right back to the beginning of a life's learning journey. We have a lot of really rich and wonderful pieces in the collection about primary and secondary school, about tertiary and vocational education, about so many other facets of education and curiosity. But Kath and Bree are right back at the beginning in that kind of 0 to 5 years space, exploring early literacy on the one hand, and also the sort of strange distinction and muddle that can be made between care and education. Did I just have someone joining me behind me? I'll let that go. So Kath, I wanted to come to you first of all and to ask you a very general question, which is what defines for you a great education?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. I think giving someone a great education is giving them the skills to keep educating themselves, you know, to keep learning, to be curious, to be engaged with the world, and to kind of, you know, to want to continue that education. You know, we've all got to leave school at some time, even though some of us put it off for a very long time. But at some point you do have to leave university and school, and you want to be able to sort of continue with that, I think.
I love that definition, and I think that sits with my Sean Tan moment too. I want to stay outside the pages of Griffith Review just for a minute, because the world that you work with is all about the importance of putting children and words, stories, creativity, writing and reading, putting them in the way of each other, in a sense. What's the power of those connections, particularly the power you've seen in the work you've done with Story Factory, in terms of the intersection between children and literacy and creativity as well?
Yeah, look, I think I find it really interesting in the sort of childhood space, because there's sort of lots and lots of programs to develop, you know, art and music and things like that. But there are very few programs to develop writing as a creative art, and on sort of assumption that, well, this is taken care of at school, and which it is. And lots of people get really brilliant educations around that in public schools across Australia. But I think sometimes it gets forgotten that it can be a really creative and amazing place in which to explore ideas, in which to test things out, and which to kind of, you know, learning to write is not just learning the basics of literacy. It is learning that you have a voice. It is learning that you have a voice that people will listen to, and it is kind of working out how to express yourself to the world. So that's that sort of nexus that we try and work at, is where we're trying to build literacy skills and things that will help young people engage with their education, because if you can't write well, you'll never get the most out of your education. But it's also that other part, which is the sort of the more intangible but sort of equally important one. And I think one of the things that we see with young people in our programs is that when they do get that sense of having told a story that they wanted to tell, and of it being heard and received, there is this real kind of confidence and real lift, particularly because a lot of the kids we work with often have very low literacy and feel like, well, I can't do that, and sort of helping them to show them that they can do that can be really transformational.
I love that sense of linking the idea of writing and the skill of writing to just getting your voice, you know, being empowered to speak and to tell your own story. I think that's wonderful. So for this story, for Learning Curves, Kath, we asked you to explore the not insignificant landscape of early literacy and some of the programs that seek to support and encourage work in that space. And I can remember when I had my son, I read that he should be put in the way of 1,000 books in his first year, which sounded like an absolutely impossible undertaking, as impossible as having a baby in the first place, until the nappy box that this was written on, you know, pointed out that when you did the maths, that was only 3 books a day for the first year. And I went, okay. Now that's a glib kind of formula. And I want to come back later and unpack what we know this kind of early exposure is doing and what we're still trying to understand. But can I start first of all to talk about some of the sort of baseline knowledge that's used to encourage new parents to share books with their children from day dot, from birth, and some of the schemes that are working, not just to provide the books, but also to kind of scaffold them with broader educational and support material, particularly for families that might not have the bookshelves that the 3 of us all have sitting behind us.
Yeah, look, there's really lots and lots of fantastic things going on in that space. And so, I mean, it's obvious that you can't learn to read unless you have books. The obverse is a bit harder. It doesn't mean that you can read just because you have books. You have to, obviously, you have to be read to you, and they have to be sort of used. But the thing that I think is kind of really interesting, because I was the same as you, Ash, like I was kind of belting through books with my kids, but because of that sort of message of, oh, you should read to your kids, was very well absorbed. And I felt like I should do this as a young mother. But I think I would have been hard pressed to articulate exactly why, you know, apart from that it will help them learn later. Whereas I think what's sort of becoming apparent now is that it's that your ability to read is built on your ability to speak. Your oral language is the thing that's really important. Kids need to develop their vocabulary. They need to develop their comprehension. They need to develop their sort of management of language. And then the kind of reading is sort of overlaid on that. And so with kind of reading books with young kids, it's not that you're sort of helping to show them the letters or anything. It's that you can have these conversations, is that you can speak to them. You can, they can learn new vocabulary, and lots of things are more common in books, you know, like you find a zebra in a book much more likely than you'll find one down the street. So there's all these things that you can kind of learn through books and build that vocabulary. So the kind of second part of I think we've sort of generally told people have received the message that it's good to read to your kids, but to think about how you do that and how you embed kind of language activities and oral language activities sort of throughout the day, not just in those kind of moments where you're reading to them before they go to sleep.
Thank you for that. And we're going to come back to lots of those points and ideas. But Bree, can I bring you in now with that, that first rather broad question? I think this probably picks up on a lot of the work that you did for your most recent book, for Who Gets to Be Smart. But what for you is the best definition of a really great education?
I would say that if I'm thinking of it the way I do from like a sort of provision perspective, and if I'm thinking of what makes a great education as in how a government should think about that, which is what I'm interested, I suppose, in investigating, the answer is the one that just puts the interests and the best interests, the wants and needs of the child first, rather than the one that puts the wants and interests and needs of parents first. And something I found throughout the research for my book, and then also again for this piece in Griffith Review, was that there is almost always a presumption on the part of policymakers and even people having conversations around these issues that the interests of the parent and the interests of the child will necessarily be the same thing. And that is not always the case. And so I would say that it's pretty obvious when you look at, for example, the way Australia does things compared to the way other countries do things, or even because in Australia, education is a state and territory thing, not just a federal thing. There are even sort of best case and worst case examples in different jurisdictions in Australia. Yeah. And I think the thing that is, the factor that links a lot of the best ones are that they use a child as a starting point rather than a parent as a starting point.
It does sound kind of obvious when you say it, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, that's the the closing line of this essay is, unfortunately for children, they cannot vote. And just that, you know, we're coming up to another election cycle. One might argue it has sort of already begun, the sort of campaigning. And the major parties are looking for lines, not even necessarily policies, it seems like. Sometimes it's just they're looking for the language or the sort of sales tactics that will appear to voters. I mean, we can talk about the interesting information that those studies that I cite in the essay showed about actual voter attitudes. But it just seems like talking about household incomes and talking about particularly women getting back to work after having kids, which obviously I think both of those things are really important. But in trying to talk about how important those things are, it's often just presumed that that will have a great impact on families and therefore be beneficial to children within families. But that does not mean that, yeah, education policy should start with parents instead of with the children.
Who Gets to Be Smart explores in the main part sort of the landscape of secondary and tertiary education and those sort of later education opportunities, and Holding the Baby, which is one of my favourite headlines in the book, which is your piece for Learning Curves, takes us back to the 0 to 5 market, so to speak, the messy space between early childhood education and the thing that we call care. Were there correlations between the ideas of power and privilege and knowledge that you investigated in the high school and university space for the book and what you subsequently found in the preschool area when you sort of came into this other space for Griffith Review?
Yeah, absolutely. The sort of overarching sense is that this idea that Australia is the land of the fair go and that people can sort of pull themselves up by the bootstraps or whatever is just an absolute farce. Everything I found out when I was researching for Who Gets to Be Smart showed that actually sort of year on year, in many ways, Australia is getting worse in terms of people's socioeconomic trajectories, kind of being in these tracks that are just set. And that education is a huge part of that, and that the meritocracy thing is a myth. It is not the case that we all sort of start from the same starting line, and where we end up is where we deserve to end up. And Kath's piece did a fantastic job at talking about how, you know, when very young people in those sort of 0 to 5 or 0 to 8 years, if they have not had the resources and love and care and support that they need in order to sort of meet those reading developmental milestones, it's really, really hard to catch them up at a later stage. And so, yeah, Who Gets to Be Smart has more of a focus on the schooling part, into more of a focus on the sort of public, private and funding divide, which is significantly more pronounced in terms of the problems it creates at the secondary stage and onwards, and what that means for people, whether or not they go to university, etc. And there was just one line in my book that was about this, which was when I found out that, you know, all of this stuff I had spoken about in the book, about these trajectories that young people sort of get set on because of this stupid divide and the just sort of unfairness of funding allocations, that those trajectories are set from primary school. And then I found this one statistic that I didn't know previously, which was that 1 in 5 children in Australia start grade 1 not being able to meet their developmental milestones. 20% of 5-year-olds are developmentally vulnerable when they start grade 1. And of course, those are typically children who are coming from low socioeconomic backgrounds, culturally, linguistically diverse backgrounds. They are not always then going to primary, let alone secondary schools that have the sort of wealth of resources that can give them the sort of attention and care they need to be able to catch up to their peers. And so that inequality just compounds. And so, yeah, I was really grateful for the opportunity. And it was just so perfect timing that you and I spoke when we did, Ash, because as I toured my book, people kept asking me, what's the one thing you think we could change about education policy that would have sort of like the biggest effect? And actually, the more I spoke about it and the more I researched for this piece, I realized if there was one thing I could change, it would actually be in early childhood education and care provision, rather than even primary, secondary, university.
So let's sit with that, those two little things there that we sort of say in one sentence: early childhood education and care. What are the aspirations and the intentions of both of those things? And how did we in Australia end up with two such distinct systems at play in the same space?
So I've really framed this piece, this essay, about that, the absurdity of that divide, because although it sounds like just sort of a choice of words, actually, when we frame the conversation in that way, it changes everything. So the information that I'm about to speak to comes from a fantastic report from 2017 called Lifting Our Game. And it talks about, it's basically just sort of accidentally, historically, the way our attitudes developed to treat kindergartens, which were often sort of, you're talking like 100+ years ago, kindergartens were sort of conceptualized as being the state and territory's responsibilities because they were an extension of schools, which, you know, that makes sense to you, that a kindy for sort of 4-year-olds is just the year before primary school begins for 5-year-olds, sure. But then when the divide really got cemented was when in the 60s and 70s, and states and territories began to develop preschool programs, and they were partially integrated with or supported by the education system. So that was still a sort of state thing connected to schools. And then it was the Childcare Act in 1972 that was the beginning of serious Commonwealth funding for what they called long daycare centres. And it was part of a huge movement and a push at the time to try and increase very specifically women's ability to get back to work. And so what you have is this historical treatment of kindergartens as being education, for one thing, that is provided by states and territories, because the states and territories mostly used to do the schools. And then you had the Commonwealth coming in with this sort of what was framed as an employment and workplace support system to try and get more Australian parents back into work, women specifically. And that was funded by the Commonwealth government. And it was basically started to be referred to as childcare. So you have this divide, and it's equally as absurd, in my opinion, as the divide between states and territories mostly paying for state schools and the Commonwealth government funding private schools. And because Australia is a federation of states like this, and because there's always tensions between both who gets to control education and care in this case, but also therefore who has to pay for it, it has become this absolute quagmire. And there are just all of these sort of competing interests, complicating factors that really are just standing in the way of holistic reform and best practice situations, which include an acknowledgement that you cannot have education without care, nor care without education. They are absolutely need to be integral in the same thing.
One of my favourite sections in your piece, Bree, was where having sort of walked us through so many of the complexities and disconnects and contradictions and just impossible to understand bits and pieces, you then talk about this review that is launched to try to understand what's going on in this sector. And even the experts who are brought in to undertake the review end up saying, you know, there were so many gaps and inconsistencies that at times even the review's attempts to understand the system were completely complicated. And, you know, you got the sense that they were scratching their heads as well. So what's the way forward here? How do we sort of start to unpack what we're currently seeing as competing and conflicting desires and the sort of broader opportunities around care and education?
I would say that, well, an example of the problem was, I'm sure lots of people who are interested in this thing would remember when Frydenberg made some announcements in 2021 last year about the Morrison government's plans in July 2022. So we'll see if this does eventuate, to make childcare. So that's the federal government. So they use the term childcare, make it more affordable. And I kept reading these ABC News articles and listening to these press conferences, trying to understand what those reforms would actually mean for families. And they were speaking English, but I wasn't getting it. And it turns out that it is really complicated. And these like new announcements that Frydenberg have made are only really relevant for families who have a second kid who is going to be in childcare at the same time as the first kid. And there are all of these sometimes different rules that apply, even depending on states and territories, for whether an after-school care program is technically part of childcare or if that's technically an extension of a kindergarten type provision. And one of those is care and one of those is education. So they're funded in different ways and go through different systems, etc. It's an absolute nightmare for parents to try to navigate. Especially it's a nightmare, there's a bit in the essay, for people from honestly low socioeconomic backgrounds, really seriously disadvantaged Australians from any cross-section of identity. So that's class, geography, race, language, if English is their second language. They are receiving this message from the government that, or from sort of services, that it's really important that their kids get to kindy, that it's really important that their kids get some kind of like preschool or sort of early learning. And then when they try and interact with that system, it is impossible to navigate and really honestly quite hostile in the way people report, trying to figure it out, trying to navigate it. And for a huge number of families, completely unaffordable. So all of those are all of the problems. And I would say those are problems that come about when we are thinking of how to make early childhood education and care for parents instead of for children. Because I think actually this is an example where it's really simple, and that if you believe that every child in Australia has the right to a free education from 5 and up, there is no argument that they do not have a corresponding right to early childhood education and care from birth. That it is that simple. That if you started trying to draft up the system and think about what would place the interests of children first, it would be a universal and free early childhood education and care system from birth, and that's it. Anything less than that in a country as rich as Australia is not good enough.
And Kath, underneath both of these pieces, there are some really big questions of equity that we need to talk about. How does equity intersect specifically with the space around early literacy and some of the research and the studies that you were exploring in your piece?
All those things that Bree was saying sort of were echoed in what I was looking at. So what you said, Bree, about, if you're behind when you're starting school, like 90% of kids, if they are behind in their literacy at the age of 5, do not make that up. I mean, that's an extraordinary statistic. And so I think the disadvantage part of it is most of the kids in that group that are behind, that 1/5 of kids who are not at their developmental milestones, most of them come from backgrounds where they're experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage. So, and the other thing is that sort of the childcare system, that's not really a system, is that the childcare centres in those areas often tend to be less well-resourced, and less well-staffed than the childcare centres in, the fancier in Bondi in Sydney, for instance. So there's a kind of, because of that, the way that the system operates, you get these huge disparities where you might have someone working in one of those centres who has a Cert 3 from TAFE, and you might have someone who has a master's in teaching, but you tend to get the younger, the less experienced educators in the more disadvantaged areas. So then the young people are kind of at home, not necessarily being able to get the education support from their parents that they might get for all kinds of reasons, often because of language barriers, all different types of things. But then they might also go to a childcare centre, which is also not as well resourced or not as doesn't have as experienced staff as it might have. Whereas you would, in a perfect world, it would obviously be the other way around. You would obviously put your best educators, your most committed and engaged educators with these kids, because if you can make that difference in that early stage, that difference will carry on for the rest of their lives.
And the next part of this sort of problem, you say, you come into a space that has been extensively noted, which is that literacy is declining in Australia. It's not that this is just, something that needs to be sorted out in, discrete places or discrete pockets. There is actually a broader trend as well. I think that you say from 2009 to 2015, there was a significant decline in literacy performance in 9 countries, and Australia was one of those. But also that a staggering 44% of Australian adults lack the literacy skills to perform everyday tasks. So, yes, there are complexities at work here, and yes, there are a lot of arguments and quibbles about what's actually being reported and measured, but what's going on at this level, just stepping out of that 0 to 5 cohort and into the sort of broader population for a moment?
Yeah, look, that is a very good question, and I do not know the answer to that. And it is a big debate in education, because there is a sort of argument that all the test scores have gone down in some ways as well, that it's not sort of confined to literacy and to writing and reading, but it does seem to be sort of particularly concentrated there. And I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know why it has happened. I mean, I think there are lots more demands placed on teachers now than there were before. There are lots more things that teachers are meant to be teaching in their curriculum. Life is much more complicated for teachers now than it used to be. I feel like that is almost certainly part of the reason there. But I think it is one of the kind of primary debates going on in education around this country at the moment.
Kath, I just want to sit with you for a little minute and to go back. This is sort of the thing that complements my, reading off the side of the nappy box moment. You talk about feeling slightly foolish when you were reading to your daughter and she wasn't even old enough to, hold up her own head at that stage. You write about not knowing that babies make more than 1 million new neural connections every second, or that their brains are 90% developed by the age of 5. And this leads you into this space of shared reading, and you write, if we've heard the message about the importance of books, we're still some way from a general understanding of why shared reading is so important, how best to do it. Can you talk about some of the benefits of that activity, not just in terms of reading capacity, but those broader skills around speaking and learning, and even just ideas of connection and exchange?
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of, it makes sense, doesn't it? You reading a book to someone, even if they are too small to even, hold their own head up, is a very passive activity. Whereas there is, even with small children, a sort of more interactive version of that, of sort of pointing to things and, touching the page and, all those little books you get where they have different textures on, things like that at the beginning. So there is a sort of version of reading that is more of an exchange, and that is the sort of thing that ideally you want to be encouraging from a very, very young age. Like I know sometimes I was very tired and I would just read Green Sheep really quickly right through to the end, but ideally you want to sort of make the sounds, and you practice making the sounds, and obviously as they get older there's more and more different types of interactions that you can have. So that obviously builds vocabulary, it builds a kind of understanding of how books works, it starts to build that sort of nascent understanding of the connection between the sort of squiggles on the page and the sounds and the meaning and things like that. But it does also create this beautiful bond between the parent and the child, and this great sense of reading as being a safe space. And it's kind of, like I remember one of the articles that I read was that you couldn't think of a better system for helping kids to love books than reading to them, in the arms of a loved one, at nighttime. Like it's how I'm sure it's how I learned to sort of love books in that first instance. So all of those things are kind of tremendously important. And the difficult thing is that for a lot of families, it is hard to find that time, because there may be literacy issues, because there is a lack of books, because, you've got lots and lots of kids and not enough time, and you've got lots of work, and, there's all kinds of things that can get in the way of that. And the studies show over and over that if you do those things, it does help build kids' literacy later in life. So how do we support and help families who don't have the sort of privilege and luxury that I had to do that on a regular basis with kids? I think that's the kind of really important question that we have to grapple with.
And part of that idea links, I think, to something that occurred to me rereading both the pieces, linked to your piece as well, Bree. There's a re-education that needs to go on. In a certain sense, you're teaching with a lot of these programs and the resources that they bring in, as well as giving children books. They're often, helping parents to learn how to read differently to someone and with someone. And I had the same sense, Bree, that, really putting aside the children that we're talking about, being educated, there's a re-education of the adults that is really kind of critical here. The way that we frame education, is it partly, Bree, do you think, about re-educating those adults, whether they're the parents, whether they're the mothers in particular, being forced to try to understand these complicated systems, whether they're teachers, whether they're policymakers? Does that bring in a different sense of the potential of what education can do, when you're acknowledging that it's not just about the object of the education, but about everybody involved in that space?
Yeah. One of the things I got the most out of when I was writing this piece was a long interview or conversation really with Jay Weatherill, who's the, I can't remember what his title is. He's sort of the head of Thrive by Five. He was it the Premier, I think, of South Australia. And now he runs Thrive by Five, which is all about, in short, doing all of the research-based advocacy to promote the benefits of a universal early childhood education and care system. And he said that the two biggest barriers to providing that early childhood education and care sort of for free from birth was an outdated understanding of the way young people learn, sort of a lack of appreciation for how incredibly fantastic play-based learning provided by experts is. And this is just all the stuff that Kath is saying, reading a book with animals in it and then making the animal noises, things that look like play, but are actually sort of well-designed combinations of play and learning in a caring and supportive and safe environment, that's the sort of sweet spot, is a combination of those two things. But there's this outdated idea that care and education are two separate things. And unfortunately, that's an idea that is held by a lot of people. It would seem policymakers in particular, but I would say also in my experience reading and writing about so-called women's issues, some of our most really deeply held stereotypes about women center around motherhood. And just as a random other example that is not at all in this essay, Ash, to answer your question, the point at which I see this most actually is in the work I do around consent and respectful relationships education in schools, because I get sort of parachuted in to give talks, usually to senior students, grade 11 and 12 students, although sometimes it's 9 and 10, to talk about consent, both sort of the sexual assault, like legal side of things, and also just ethical consent, what it looks like when two individuals who respect each other decide to come together. And it is quite frustrating to understand more and more each year that the young people are so hungry and thirsty for this information being given to them in a no-nonsense way. And often it's the parents and teachers who are not ready or willing to have, or they don't know how. No one ever had a really open, using the right words for the right things conversation with them about it with their kids. So how would they had that conversation with them when they were kids? So how could they just expect to sort of miraculously pick it up and be able to do the same with theirs? Yeah, I think, although from a policy perspective, as I said, it would be best if education policy was decided with the child's interests being paramount. You're right. If we're going to make fundamental change through society, we can't just sort of leave parents behind. I think,
it's a different kind of lifelong learning, I guess. Kath, were you jumping in there as well?
Yeah, because there's a study that I talk about in my piece of the Let's Read program that the Smith family runs, and one was trying to change the way that parents were talking to kids while they were reading with them. And that kind of didn't really show a great change, which is not to say that nothing happened, but they just couldn't really show it. Whereas when they trained early childhood educators to do that work with the kids, there was a change, there was a shift. But part of that is not just that they are doing this sort of work, doing this dialogic reading with the children while they are at the early childhood centre. It's that they are also feeling confident and empowered enough to talk to the parents when the parents come in. So then they can talk to them, or, here's a book, you can take this home, you could do this. And, so you have to kind of do both of those things. Like, it's very hard if you've kind of got these two systems sort of running with no connection between them. And part of having really great early childhood educators is that they can build some of that support around the child, even when they're not in the centre.
I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I think Keenan is just telling me to keep an eye on the time, and leaving some space for your questions out there in the world. I wanted to just end, in a sense, with the endings of your two pieces, and Bree, you've already referred to your fantastic last line here, but one of the things that's always really exciting about curating the different editions of Griffith Review is when you start to see the sort of intersections and touch points, I guess, between different pieces, the ways in which the ideas sort of start to talk to each other between different writers' work. And I had the sense in the close that you both brought your work to. There was a really beautiful sort of quickening and kind of power in how those two pieces sort of came to their final full stop. So Bree, as you say, you close with this wonderful observation of saying, we have data showing what a sound investment ECEC is. We have data showing how critical the first 5 years are for a human's development. Unfortunately for children, they cannot vote. Kath, you described, so many of the people that you spoke with for the piece talking about hoping that a national strategy might prompt significant change, but this sort of hope being tempered by, emotions that can begin with resignation and range to kind of fury. And as you say, it's a tragedy that in a country as wealthy as Australia, more than 1 in 5 children might not open a book, might not have that moment of sort of connection and potential, when you know that in those early years, that is when their brains are sort of doing all the work. But still, you know, we fail to invest at a national level in this space. So Bree, I wanted to ask you, first of all, what's the best way of working towards focus and kind of agency in this space? How do we begin to aim for something universal? And maybe getting into an election cycle is exactly the right time to be asking that question.
I would just say that for sort of any regular folks listening, if what you mean to just when you're chatting to each other, when you're talking to anyone, anywhere, to your partner, at your workplace, when you pick your kids up from kindy, wherever it is, unless you mean to say childcare, try not to refer to early childhood education and care as just childcare, or just like people taking care of little kids, or like watching the kids, unless that's specifically what you mean. The way we talk about what these services are and should be, and what these services should provide, actually has a huge impact on how we think about this issue, and honestly, like whether we think it's something that the government has an obligation to provide for the future of the country. And the other thing I would say is that one of the really great things that Thrive by Five do is they do this national survey called the Early Learning Monitor, which explores how everyday Australians and parents think the early learning system currently works, and how it impacts children into adulthood, and how important these issues are to their votes. And they've just, I looked at all these different categories, and consistently, around 3/4 of Australians actually support a high quality universal early childhood education and care system. And even more profound than that, it's low single digits of people who actually are opposed to it. You know, the appeal of a measure like this is significant, and it's broad, but it's only that significant and broad if you talk about it as a provision in the interests of children. As soon as you start talking about, and this is why the terminology is so important, as soon as you start talking about it as something that will help women get back to work, as soon as you start talking about early childhood education and care being something that will help household incomes and that the government should help to subsidize, popular support for extra funding going to these things starts to go downhill very, very quickly. But Australians have a wonderful track record of supporting and getting behind sort of rights-based service provision. And when we frame the issue as one about equality for children, I have faith, I have hope. Australians actually are on board with that, in the same way that we get very defensive of public schools in general and the health system in general. I do feel optimistic that just with reframing the debate, if that was all that could happen, even in this year, it would make a huge difference, I think, to the way people understood the way this issue was spoken about in the election cycle.
And Kath, you close your piece with a great quote from Mary Ruth Mendel, who's with the Australian Literacy and Numeracy Foundation, who says, Australia's got to pull itself together when it comes to the children of Australia. It's said all the time that they're the future of Australia. Really get serious about it. What has to happen for us to get serious? What do we need?
I love that quote from Mary Ruth. And one of the sort of fantastic things about her is that she hasn't lost her fury about this issue. And because it's, you know, Bree and I had the same experience of everyone you talk to, like there's so much evidence. There's so much research. It's not like we don't know this. We absolutely know this, and we know this beyond a shadow of a doubt. And still we are not doing it. So, and that's the kind of, that's the sort of incredibly frustrating part of it. And so part of what I was talking about in my piece was trying, you know, people like Mary Ruth, but really sort of wonderful people pulling together, trying to create a national early language and literacy strategy as a kind of small starting point. Because at the moment, you know, we have, once kids hit school, there is a progression to learn literacy through the school curriculum. But before that, there's not anything, you know, there's sort of bits about literacy in the early years learning framework, all these different policy documents, which are as fractured as the sector itself, but there's nothing where there's a national commitment to that. And it does fall often between, ministerial portfolios. So as a kind of starting point, if we could just agree that this is what we are aiming for, and if we could nudge that number of the 23% of kids who start school developmentally vulnerable, if we could, Sue McKerricher, who's just the retired head of the Libraries Association of Australia, she said if we could just get that down to 1 in 10, like it's still not perfect, but that would still, that was half the number of kids for whom that has happened. So that would be my kind of first wish.
Thank you so much both for that. Christine, do we have anything you need?
Oh, so many.
Oh,
So
okay.
many questions.
I can't see any of them. Good.
No, but we won't be able to get to them all, but I'll start with Kerry's question. I'm curious about the types of data that schools insist upon and what you all feel is developmentally appropriate to collect/assess. Yeah.
They do that through the Australian Childhood Development Index, which I can't say I am completely across, but I know that it is assessing things like, vocabulary, the awareness of how, sort of phonological awareness, different aspects of literacy at a very early stage, obviously, which is a complicated thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Does sound a bit. I'll ask Laura's question now too, which is a bigger problem not the varying expectations between parents and child, but between families and providers who profit? For-profit childcare centres can surely never deliver best results for the child.
Yeah, all I can say to that is I don't have any kids, and when I read for sort of research that didn't make it into this essay, but just to sort of take the temperature of the room, like when I read message boards online or just sort of comments threads, there is a huge amount, it seems to me, of bubbling kind of resentment from a lot of parents and families who have the best interests of their children at heart towards the feeling of them like feeling forced to send their kids to for-profit like early childhood centres of varying types, that they would much rather have a kind of state provided option which is not driven by profit and instead has different KPIs to measure its success. All I would say to that is that I think that is a symptom of the problem rather than the source of the problem, because if we did actually have a universal early childhood education and care system, that profit as a driver would not be nearly as much of a problem.
Cool. There's a lot of people commenting about different education systems around the world and how the early education is valued in other places, Finnish education, France, and even people who are saying that their home life was, an education system in itself, and that people used to be able to, read whole books when they arrived at school at grade 5, and that maybe that's not quite the same today. So there's lots of comments like that. Can
I just reply to that quickly? Sorry. So the Australian government only commits about 0.5% of GDP to early childhood education and care. In New Zealand, it's 0.8%. In the UK, it's 1.1%. And in a bunch of different Nordic countries, as always, it's up to 2%, which, as you can imagine, as a percentage of GDP is a colossal difference. And Canada have also just committed to a universal early childhood education and care system as a way to come out of COVID, which is pretty much the opposite of what Australia has done in snapping back those measures.
That is great. Look, there are quite a few other questions here, but I am aware that we're getting very close to time. I think that I will send these questions to you directly so that you know the kind of things that people are thinking about. I think that this subject from this particular issue of Griffith Review has certainly piqued a lot of interest, and certainly there's a lot more to be discussed. I personally would like to ban private schools, and now I'm going to get a furor of people.
Oh yeah.
And private education from very young as well. So Socialist Chrissy Neen is now going to thank my guests today. It has been fantastic to host this Zoom event with you, Ashley Hay, and also thank you to Catherine Keenan and to Bree Lee for talking about your subjects so clearly, deliberately and well. It has been an absolute pleasure to listen to you.
Thank you,
all.
everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you very much.
See you all later. Bye.